The Yakuza video game franchise has been woke for a very, very, very long time. There have been woke characters in the franchise since at least Yakuza 5, probably earlier, but this has been a thing for a long time. This didn't come out of nowhere. There were people like myself warning you about this. This was the major reason that I dropped the franchise. I wasn't exaggerating, right? I wasn't making it up. I knew this was going to happen. Because, of course, Sega is not a Japanese company. It has always been an American controlled, just complete subversive, blight on the Japanese gaming industry. Back in the 90s, they pulled the same kind of stunts that Sony and Microsoft are doing now, tricking people who don't play a lot of video games into thinking that their games are more mature and more sophisticated than Nintendo's. And that's been, in a way, it's kind of odd to see how it's kind of developed, how people genuinely believe that Sega is a Japanese company, despite being founded by American businessmen, right? It is one of the great subversions in gaming history that Sega has been able to gaslight so many people into thinking that it's an American company, it's a Japanese company, right? And that is why, over the past several years, we've been seeing that Sega has been at the forefront of pushing woke agendas in Japan, right? They were behind the article that we saw the other day in regards to like trying to damage control for localizations, which up until now had been very, very, very well swept under the rug for Japanese audiences, right? Uh, they've been throwing propaganda into their games. They've been trying to westernize the Japanese gaming sphere since its very inception. And now, only now are people starting to realize that something is up. With Yakuza and Persona, two series that are seen as being extremely Japanese centric, becoming westernized and therefore woke, more and more people are beginning to understand the blight that Sega has been inflicting on the industry. So much so that I'm not even sure that this thing about Sega is even ever going to be properly understood, right? The issue right now, as I see it, in regards to like the Yakuza thing, is that people really have unfortunately genu- genuinely have this mindset that the localization team alone is to blame, right? That's what everyone is saying, is that like, oh, the localization team are gaslighting the Japanese into doing this thing that nobody wants. No, no. The Japanese people who have been promoted through Sega, who have risen to the ranks, who control the properties, who control the brand, who control the company, have been handpicked by these kind of activists, right? You're seeing this more and more with a lot of these other westernized Japanese studios, Capcom, Square Enix. Like you're seeing this more and more from them, where they're handing over their beloved IPs, stuff like Resident Evil, stuff like Final Fantasy, stuff like all sorts of things, to Western creators, right? Trying to catch that almighty Western audience, right? Because they know they're never going to be able to compete in Japan, right? The issue, like in Japan, is that the Japanese are much more willing to acknowledge that Nintendo is the superior console to own, that the Switch is winning the console war, that there's really no reason to own anything but a Switch in the current era. But everyone else is like really delusionally trying to keep up the facade. They're like, no, a PC is viable, mobile is viable, Xbox and PlayStation are viable, right? Like they're doing everything in their power to try and stay off of Nintendo hardware, right? They're doing everything they can. And in order to do this goal, right? In order to fulfill this mission, this objective, this agenda, they need every resource they can take advantage of. And I do think a major part of that is catering to the West. Doing everything in their power to like get those ESG dollars, get those people on board, get people talking positively about their brand, to westernize it, to get like people like frothing at the mouth, to try and make it the next Call of Duty, right? To try to make it that something that people will blindly consume, regardless of quality, regardless of the time actually spent in the game, regardless of like anything, right? People will just blindly consume every Yakuza just because it's Yakuza. Persona just because it's Persona, right? With no real regard for the quality, the content, the what you actually do in the game, or like whether or not there are better games out there, right? They want that kind of audience, the kind of people who just blindly consume everything that's thrown in front of them, right? And that's what they're trying to do. That has always been their goal. That they have no respect for you, the consumer. They don't care about you at all. And this is becoming more and more evident, seeing these people kind of refuse to acknowledge the problem with westernizing their games. You know, becoming less gameplay focused, becoming less original, becoming more of a parody of themselves, refusing to grow and innovate, and just becoming stagnant, right? Like a Dragon is really interesting because it really is the textbook example of how the West handles woke properties, right? We saw this with Seven, where they give us everything that people wanted from a Yakuza game, right? They gave us the new protagonist, they gave us like a new combat system, they gave us like this gripping story, all these mini games they tried really hard to sell people on Like a Dragon, right? Yakuza 7. They really tried to make that a good game. They didn't take any risks with it. They just did the same thing they always did. And then with the sequel, they decided to push the bar. They decided to become subversive. They decided to just do their woke thing. And you'll notice this is pretty similar. This is pretty typical for Western properties. Batman did it. The Arkham games have done it. The Last of Us Part Two is infamous for it. And you're always gonna see like the woke media just kind of refusing to acknowledge there's any real problem with the games at all. In fact, whenever a game is like really heavily woke, that's when they defend it the hardest, right? You saw this with The Last of Us Part 2, where people refuse to acknowledge the game isn't very good and that the story makes no sense, and that they seriously try to pretend that Ellie is some like tragic figure in video games. One of the best female protagonists of all time, right? You're seeing this now with Yakuza 8, right? Where it has a ton of problems, where the story makes no sense, like the acting, like the it's all a major step down from what fans are used to. But like all anybody can do, like in opening weeks, all the major critics are saying this is like one of the best Yakuza games ever made, which in and of itself is a red flag because they said the same thing about The Last of Us Part 2. They said the same thing about BioShock Infinite. They said the same thing about like a lot of other woke subversive material that people don't really acknowledge or talk about, right? Like, and again, um, this is to be expected, right? Like this is the problem with the video game industry is that people just don't want to acknowledge that these games have problems, right? That that nobody really makes good games anymore. That Nintendo's the only company that's consistently been putting out good stuff for the past decade or so. And like every time that someone props up something, whether it's Baldur's Gate 3 or Pow World or Yakuza, like it always falls flat on its face. Again, it's amazing how Yakuza put out like several mediocre entries before Yakuza 8. Kiwami 1 and 2, 6. Uh, 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 Ishin, right? I've seen people say Ishin, Spoonie, whose opinion you should not take seriously. Spoonie went on Twitter and said that, like, yeah, Ishin is the worst Yakuza game I've ever finished, right? And like, you don't see a lot of people talk about it. All they can do is just make excuses for everything that the studio is doing. Whether it's hiring Yang Ye or completely butchering the plot, completely emasculating the main characters, right? Refusing to really acknowledge that, Western culture is kind of terrible, right? And it's only going to get worse for here, for sure. And I think the Japanese audience are already aware that something is up because, it's interesting that this damage control article went up on Japanese outlets, and the West responded to it. Like, it really does feel like the anti-West sentiment is rising in Japan, and we're seeing more and more base creators rise up against it. I don't think that traditionally, a lot of these big studios were able to coast by on their big IPs, but I no longer think that's true. Like seeing Final Fantasy collapse the way it did, seeing Resident Evil collapse the way it did, seeing like all this other stuff, like all these other big name IPs, like people aren't going to come out if the game isn't quality. And there are a handful of exceptions for that, but typically they're like new things that nobody's really played before. And people quickly get tired of them, whether it's Baldur's Gate 3 or Paul World. Like there are things like that become meme games, become flavor of the month, but are quickly forgotten. But like they are very, very few and far between, right? And even then, like plenty of people talk about the woke elements of Baldur's Gate 3. Plenty of people talk about the woke elements of Overwatch or whatever. Like the reality is the ideology is dying. Like that's been the trend since 2014, I think, is that the ideology is like entrenched in the industry now. It's ruining all these games that people used to like, and people are now turning their backs on it, just like they turned their backs on Hollywood. Just like how nobody takes Hollywood seriously anymore, people are not going to take the gaming industry anymore. Like right now, people are in this phase where like, oh, Japan's gonna save us, but Japan has been compromised. They have been compromised for a long time. It's time to stop thinking in terms of nationality and think in terms of overall quality. And there are developers out there that have continued to put out good work and will continue to put out good work in the future, but they're typically smaller devs or Nintendo, right? Like the reality is that people need to take a harder stand against woke nonsense. All right, I am not seeing enough people criticize Like a Dragon 8, but my belief is that like this is going to be a repeat of the Mortal Kombat 11 situation, right? In which the game came out, everybody cried it was woke, it sold a bazillion copies, and people tried to gaslight you into thinking go woke, go broke is a myth, bro. But then the sequel came out, Mortal Kombat 1, and nobody bought it. It sold like 3 million copies. Nobody's like playing the game. Nobody's excited about the DLC. Nobody wants to play as Omni-Man, okay? Like Mortal Kombat 1 was a huge drop in quality, and I think that drop is going to continue in the near future. Like, I think the IP is stagnant, right? There is not going to be any more growth. People are done with Mortal Kombat because it hasn't been able to innovate. And I think Yakuza is in the same position, right? Just like how I thought, like, CD Projekt Red was in a bad position after Witcher 3. Like, this is going to be a repeat of that situation. And the industry is going to cry about it. They are going to be in denial about it. They are going to prop up every little single tiny thing they can to try and deny reality. But more and more gamers are like becoming aware of what's going on, what to look out for, and who they can trust in this industry. And I do think that the beginning of the end is here, right? I mean, it's been happening for the past decade, right? But like the reality is that you cannot run your business on an ideology. That's the issue. Like you need to sell an actual product. And more, these companies are not producing products that people actually want to buy. And as a result of that, their propaganda has become completely ineffective. This is the beginning of the end for the woke agenda.